Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are around the world and joining us. I'm Jo Henry. I am the Managing Director of BookBrunch, and I'm delighted we got so many people joining us for this Greening the Book Industry event that we're running in association with HP Publishing Services, who were actually making available to the industry a whole range of resources around how we can help the book trade get greener, including their new white paper, Reduce Your Carbon Footprint, which will be sent to everyone after this event. This is such an important topic for everyone. How can we make our industry more sustainable and more environmentally friendly? I'm delighted that we are being joined by such an expert panel to discuss this today. And we look forward to hearing everyone's questions and thoughts on the subject. And I'm sure you won't hold back on that. So a little bit of housekeeping. We're recording the speakers, so could you keep yourself on mute, please? I think you are muted at the moment. To ask a question at any time in the next hour, can you post it in the chat box and I will pick it up and ask it on your behalf. To warn you, we also have some poll questions that we're going to ask you, the audience, to give us your views on, and we look forward to hearing those. And I'm now going to hand over to Ashley Gordon, who's the HP Publishing Solutions Manager in the US, who's going to introduce the session and get the speakers to introduce themselves. So over to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Jo, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see so many names, some of which are familiar. So thank you for coming today. And as Jo said, it's an incredibly important topic. And so today what we're hoping to do is actually have a discussion of which you can partake so that at the end of this hour, we all do something a little differently than we did when we got here. And we're incredibly lucky to have what turns out to be, because this was sort of a, hey, would you do this? Would you do this? Three people who have both a tremendous amount of experience. They also have experience outside of publishing, each of them, as it turned out. So they bring to this issue a different perspective and the ability for us to learn from others. And they also have just slightly different views about each thing. So they're going to act as a roundtable. There's, I think, not a single PowerPoint slide for the next hour, which is refreshing. And as they have their discussion, we have topics that we want to cover, but we welcome your input. And the poll, as Jo said, is so that they can understand who all of you are and where you are, so that what we talk about is appropriate and most helpful to what you want to hear. So thank you very much. And this is to launch the white paper, but having a conversation is a little more fun to get it going. So first, would like for each of our panelists to introduce themselves. They're going to tell you what they do and where they do it, and also that little bit about where they came from, so you can see what their external experience has been. So in this case, I'm going to go to the end of what I see. So we'll do Courtney, Ariel, and Matt, please. Courtney, you want to get us started?
Yeah, perfect. Hi, everyone. So I'm Courtney Ward. I'm the Sustainability Production Manager for Penguin Random House UK. I have been there a very short time, only a year and a half, so fairly new to the publishing industry. But I have been working in sustainability and labour rights for about 7 years in the fashion and beauty and a little bit in the food industry. So I worked for Selfridges, and after Selfridges, I worked for a company called ASOS, which is a fast fashion giant in the UK. And I think it really helps me understand how big this issue really is, and how much in the different industries, even though we've got challenges, they're all very similar. So I think it's really interesting to have that collaboration and have a collective approach as well.
Thank you, Courtney. Ariel?
Hi, thank you, Ashley and Jo, for having me present on this panel. My name is Ariel, and I am the Sustainability Manager at Macmillan. And I work across both the trade publishing in the US, Germany, UK, Australia, as well as Macmillan Learning in the US. And like Courtney, I'm sort of new to publishing. I've been at Macmillan for 3.5 years. And before Macmillan, I also worked in food, I've worked in apparel, and I've worked in facility services, actually. So I also have a wide breadth of sustainability knowledge. I hold a master's from the Yale School of the Environment in this space, and I agreed that I do bring things that I've learned elsewhere into the publishing space as well.
Thank you. And Matt, bringing up the rear.
Hi everyone, good to see you all. My name's Matt Haslam and I'm Managing Director of Chelsea Green Publishing UK. I started the business up, was approached in tail end of 2017 to start a new business in the UK, where we've been distributing titles in from the US. Chelsea Green in the US has been around since 1984 with a mission of sustainable, regenerative and sort of ethically driven publishing. So I very much inherited that as my kind of driver and brief to bring it through a new UK lens. Yeah, I've been doing that for the last 3 years, which was a departure from my time prior as a marketing director at Faber & Faber. And then before that, I co-owned a creative agency, so would work with blue chip brands across all different sectors on especially digital and brand content and consumer marketing. So my background really comes from that area, and that's the way I kind of run things through my lens of the relationships between books and readers.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's start with a poll. We're going to, if this were in person, I would be walking around with the microphone and I would find the person who least wants to talk and hand it to them. So there it is. Great. So that we can understand and get a sense of who's in the room, if you will, what are the resources in your organization that are available to address this issue? So pick the one of the three that works best for you. So are you lucky in that you have a Courtney or an Ariel or a Matt who really focuses on this? Is it something that a few people address it and it's part of their daily responsibilities or general responsibilities, or is it just kind of a all hands on deck when something comes up, we all work on it together, but it's not the responsibility of any individual or set of individuals? So how's it looking, Hannah? Do I actually need to answer this for it to go away? I think maybe I do. All right, I answered too. So there we go, great. So here we are. So actually 17% of you have a person who does this. That's good to hear. And it's the focus of some, so that's actually pretty good. If you add those two together, that's quite a lot of resources devoted to this. And then, okay, no formal yet. You too will be part of this discussion. So we're going to talk about both things to move an existing strategy forward, and then we'll touch on, if you don't quite have one that is coherent yet, what are some first steps you can take? Okay, perfect, good start. Thank you everybody who answered. All right, panelists. So we had a lot of preliminary discussions in pulling this together, and what was obviously apparent, this also will show up in the white paper, and which presents certain positions, and it's just hard to get a handle on exactly what to do, how to do it. There's a lot of data about this issue. There's not necessarily consistent data. We measure things differently, and that can lead you to sometimes contradictory conclusions. So starting with Courtney and then working our way through, how did your organization decide what to focus on or where to start? Because we can't do everything at once. And obviously, as a publisher, you only have a limited impact on a very large, supply chain universe. So how did PRH say, okay, this is where we're putting our stake in the ground?
I mean, that's a great question. We, first of all, we have Bertelsmann, who are our parent company. And what they did about 2 years ago was decide that all of their companies under their umbrella are going to be climate neutral by 2030. So that was also the driving force behind us. That then led us to do other things, some things that we've been doing for years, some things that are new to us. So first of all, we wanted to look at where our biggest impact lies. And I do think looking at climate change and having that as kind of the big strategy piece is such an umbrella for other things around kind of your raw materials, your sourcing, what you do on your sites, and what you do that can be influenced by others, or what you can control. So there's many things under that umbrella that you can do, which is why it's probably our biggest priority. And then looking at our biggest impact, I would say for us, we kind of took 3 key areas. So the first is our site sustainability and our business operations. The second would be our supply chain. This isn't in order of impact. And the last would be engaging both internally and externally within that. So for us, our site sustainability, one thing that we did was we hired an external consultant. We looked at facilities, looked at our distribution processes, and advised us to get an ISO 14001 environmental management standards. That's something that we're implementing right now. For our supply chain, I created a sustainable sourcing strategy, which focused on monitoring and implementing change. So really working kind of up close with our suppliers, understanding what their needs are, because we have global suppliers. You know, some don't have the same capabilities that others do, especially when it comes to raw materials or paper sourcing, or the processes that they use. Some are much further ahead. So it's about understanding your supplier's capability and how you can best support them. We also work with the Book Chain project, and they kind of help support us on that too. And lastly, it's about engaging both internally and externally. And I think you can do that through things of research. So first of all, research the types of materials that we're using. So for instance, paper for us, we are on the whole debate of recycled versus virgin. And for us, we did a external piece of report, got a third party in, who said some of our virgin papers were actually better than some of the recycled out there. That was really interesting for us to understand, and engage our employees and staff and suppliers about that, and just say, like, this is what we're doing, but we need to go further. We need to create, you know, life cycle assessments for others. We need to understand more. And then lastly, it's kind of focusing on carbon emissions and really understanding, because for us, our supply chain is about 96% of our carbon emissions. So how do we actually get that down? And you mentioned about data, and that there's conflicting data out there, which is absolutely true, because I don't think there is really a standardized approach for publishing, for collecting all of your carbon data and understanding exactly where it comes from. You have certain companies that can do that for you, but there's always some kind of, you know, agenda or something there for you which you're not too sure, and especially if you're new to this area, you're not 100% sure. So me, as a beginning point, I would always say to kind of get the key change makers in the room, really understand what it is. Sorry if I'm going on a bit, just let me know. So get the key change makers in the room, really understand what the issues are, what your priorities are as a business, and set up kind of accountability, because even though I'm dedicated resource, we expect our whole company to be part of this.
Great. So let's do Ariel next, because I'm guessing, Ariel, you can build on a lot of what Courtney said, being in a similar circumstance. And again, we'll let Matt bring up the rear on this one too, because it's going to be a slightly different answer, I'm thinking.
Great. Yes, we are similar to PRH UK in that regard, in many regards. So Macmillan started its journey back in 2009 when we published Confessions of a Radical Industrialist by Ray Anderson, who was the founder of Interface Carpets. And it was kind of one of those eye-opening experiences for our CEO at the time, John Sargent. And he was like, wow, this traditional, really nasty industry can do something amazing. Why can't we? So Bill Berry was hired in 2010 to conduct Macmillan's first carbon analysis. And similarly, we found that paper, also unsurprisingly, is the greatest contributor to emissions in our overall emissions inventory. And what we decided immediately was that we needed to, you know, use that as a hotspot analysis, right? So if when we are ordering paper directly or guided through one of our, you know, middlemen, then we are specifying that we want a low carbon paper. And that's the main contributor to our decline in carbon emissions over the years. For when we're working with printers and they're supplying paper, that is not something we've tackled yet, but it's what we like to call sustainability 2.0, and it's for the future, and something to consider for all companies out there. All paper mills have carbon emissions. It's part of their inventory. Many of them are publicly held and contributing to CDP, which is one of the resources out there that help companies kind of align to make sure that they are not missing any huge gaps in their analysis. And as a result, we've switched some of our paper out and are always pushing companies to do better. And another thing that we've worked on is our car fleet. It's not very large, but back in the day, we had a lot of really gas guzzling vehicles and petrol guzzling vehicles in the UK. We're making efforts to switch to hybrids. We're piloting an electric vehicle right now. So that has some pretty exciting things moving forward. And then lastly, we are aiming to be 100% renewable across all of our offices and warehouses by 2025. We're about 70% a year ago, and so hoping to maintain that now. And we do that through buying RECs, like after we have like our energy totals for the year, we buy RECs, or we do it through our energy utility supplier, like Green Mountain Energy, for example, is a company in the US that could be an option. Or in Germany, it's really easy to switch offices because they have significant investment in that space publicly. And another thing that I also work on is like Courtney is trying to take sustainability out of my team. And so we have sustainability task forces at Macmillan Publishers in the US, and they're interdisciplinary cross-functional teams. They're really small, but they've been really enlightening to both myself and Bill.
So that's really interesting. Both companies set a date. You established a target, but you established slightly different targets, where one of you says carbon neutral by this date, and then Macmillan says 100% renewable by this date. So slightly different paths. Is that right?
Yeah, and I forgot to mention we have been carbon neutral since 2017 across full scope 1, 2, 3 globally. So we're a little smaller than PRH, so it's a different category and framework.
Okay, well, that's the perfect
segue.
Are great. Great. Perfect segue to Matt, who is even smaller than both of you. So we have an independent publisher who was frankly founded on a lot of these principles. So you've been thinking about it for a really long time, but even so, the climate change discussion and what we know about it has changed since Chelsea Green was founded. So how, Matt, what does it mean when you're a niche focused indie publisher making these decisions where your authors have been writing about it for quite a while?
I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches up front compared to where these guys have had to come in from, in terms of the industry, in the respect that, having come from a traditional medium side, big indie in the UK in Faber, it is a thought, but it's not a consideration on any meaningful level day to day for people. And coming to a business, and I pulled out our kind of ethos, which is on the Chelsea Green site. This is something that they've been thinking about, that the publishing is a tool for cultural change and ecological stewardship. So we align our editorial mission with our production ideals to reduce our business impact on the environment. I mean, that was what was said in 1984, and everything thereon has been based in or around that. And, we laugh about the fact that we publish books that are sometimes 10 years ahead of the curve. So arguably there's no curve involved, but fundamentally those books have value, and there are people who are creating radical change. Racy Anderson, we published his original book 2020 now to probably 25 years ago. So, Mid-Course Correction, which was his big sort of radical change book at Interface. So to Ariel's point, he was kind of Jerry Maguire moment in the kind of circular economy. But this is all stuff I've had to learn. This is stuff that I've become interested in and passionate about. To give you the kind of, metrics on it, we were up in the UK, so we're a new division, as I said. This is a new story I have to tell here. I have the production. We print locally in the UK, we print locally in the US. We ship minimally. We have incredibly tiny returns. We're very frugal. And we really work on our supply chain as and when we can. But, I have a kind of brilliant battle-hardened production director who just hammers suppliers until she's happy with everything that we've got, chlorine-free recycled paper, vegetable inks, etc., etc. In real terms, the topics that kind of hand-in-glove editorial and production is a really interesting place. We were 65% up year to date last year, and we're 40% up this year in the UK. And we were 40% up in the US last year and 50% up this year in the US. Now, this is a business that's been around 35 years. So I'd like to take some credit for that, having come on board in 2018. But my point being, these issues are becoming issues that are crossing over to reader level. You know, I was joking to the guys yesterday when we were talking about this panel. You know, I went from literary London to in the fields in the middle of the UK where there was farming events. It was quite a shock for me, but with my background and my ability to kind of the way I think about putting things together when it comes to what we do, it was really, really fascinating to see that relationship between soil, food health, gut health, and what readers are interested in. And that path is really small and everyone's getting there on that path. And I think that will have a huge effect on helping the reader. In the Bertelsmann model, we've got the kind of top-down big commitment stuff. The reader also to bolster that vision for the bigger publishers in the marketplace.
So one through line then, and I know, Joe, you're about to jump in.
I'm going to jump in. Yeah.
Yep, you are. So one through line that I'm hearing then from all of you is, and something that, you know, Chelsea Green can learn from the larger, or any independent can learn from the larger companies that do have the resources. And so here's what a sustainability task force department person would look like. Whereas Chelsea Green or any smaller independent has more of an ability to do what Ariel and Courtney are talking about, which is to move that initiative outside of their departments. You know, an indie house can do that pretty quickly because you can get to everybody can get in a room. But what I also hear from all of you is that the content you're producing, in fact, with Ariel and Don Sargent, it, you know, big deal. If you start looking at the books you're publishing and aligning some of your content and acquisitions with what you're trying to accomplish, and then it becomes, you know, maybe they're bits that we can take from each of you, regardless of the size of our own organizations. Yeah. Okay, Joe.
So interesting question come in. Are any of the printing companies you use switching to renewable energy? The person with the question is doing a lot of work on measuring scope 3 emissions and trying to engage with suppliers and convince them to make the switch. How are you finding that as an experience? And as a supplementary, I'm assuming the questioner says that Amazon prints a lot of your titles. Are they willing to supply you with data about their paper supplies, energy usage at their sites, etc., etc.?
If anybody starts to feel uncomfortable about talking about specific suppliers, I know it's a little different in the UK than it is in the US. We get twitchy really fast over here. So if anybody needs to go, oh, whoops, no, we can't do that, you know, just raise a hand and we'll stop.
Yeah, and it's perhaps just not naming companies, but saying how you've persuaded them to make these.
That's probably a good plan.
Commit to it.
Okay,
I'm happy to go first. We've had some luck, definitely, but it is a challenge. It's not easy. So one of the things that I did looking at my suppliers, because we have around 70 printers, for instance, and what I did was look at the top like 80% of actual volume that we would use, and that actually only came across from 10-15 printers. So what I would do is, what I still do is I have these bi-monthly meetings, monthly with some, on actually just sustainability and ethical trade with just these printers. And with that, I have an agenda. And part of that agenda is carbon emissions. What are you doing to reduce your carbon emissions? I've had some luck. I've had some printers who have engaged with science-based targets. I've had some printers who have switched to renewable energy, only 2, I can't name them, but it's really good. I want to say it's partly down to me, but it's also partly down to like a reduction of cost as well from their side, which is great for them. I've had some printers install solar panels, and I've had some printers look at it and ask me more questions and are actually engaged in it. But I've also had some printers turn around and say, no, I'm not ready yet. So then I ask what they can do instead. So it's all about that capability with suppliers. And then in terms of Amazon, that's an absolutely great question. I think we need to engage with retailers more. It's something that we do a lot of downstream, but we don't do a lot of upstream. So that's kind of on my agenda for the future as well.
So Matt and Ariel, just to touch on it quickly, like yes, no, have you had success? And do you think that success is because of what you've brought to the print provider, or what they already felt like they needed to do, and then you became a great partner? Where did it start?
I think, size can sometimes dictate change. And I think where we've got to is I think one of the, my publisher, Margot, who set up Chelsea Green in 1984, one of the things that I think is interesting coming into the industry, particularly this part of the industry 3.5 years ago, was the concept that it was a kind of a bit hippy dippy and it was kind of a bit soft. She is as radical and punk as anyone I've ever met in publishing. And that is a really interesting thing. And I think the concept that green is kind of soft is a problem. And I think that actually change will come from pressure. Change will come from corporate pressure, from big pressure. So in our case, we have created 35 years worth of relationships with what we would consider high quality paper mills, high quality publishers who are doing the work at a scale and a level of quality over quantity for us, because we're a niche publisher. And that elicits in developing a relationship with the kind of readers we have. So we do have a relationship in the main, especially in the US, where we're much more entrenched. In certain parts of the market, people will pay for that. They will come and pay, they will buy directly from us. They will search out some of our authors because they're coming through us. And part of that process is knowing that as we said, the editorial meets the production piece, and that matters to customers. Whether it moves the dial on a bigger scale is the bigger question. And I think that I would love, it's fantastic to hear Courtney's having those conversations and moving incredibly traditional businesses forward, because they are, they're old as time publishers, printers, sorry. And I think that in itself is something that is problematic, is at what point, if you're 5 years out from retirement and you're looking to be a big investment piece, you think, oh, can I hold on? There's big questions in there, and who makes that change? And I think that, hearing the big publishers having those harder conversations with printers who need to respond to those markets that may elicit who knows how much percentage of their revenue annually, working with a big customer, that's going to be where the change happens. I think all we can do is badger and be bigger than the sum of our parts to try and make those things happen from a smaller publisher perspective.
Ariel, anything you want to jump in with on that question?
So we have not on a comprehensive, cohesive, scale engaged printers. What we're hoping to do as the industry is moving in this direction is that organizations like BISG, International Green Publishers Alliance, BIC, help move that needle, because like both Matt and Courtney have alluded to, it really needs to be done systematically.
Perfect. And Ariel, you're going to get to talk again in just a second. I want you to lead off on the next question, but this is a perfect segue into our second poll, because we were talking about, who's influencing this? Where is the impetus for this coming from? What we all know in publishing is that we're a little bit different in that we often are not the known brand, and we often do not have a direct relationship with the end consumer. And whereas in the industries that you guys have come from, like food and fashion, it is often the end consumer who is really pushing for this. They are making their purchasing choices based on finding companies and brands that reflect their own values. So it's a little bit different in publishing, where it's often the author who is the brand, unless you're, indie, niche, and you have been able to build that kind of relationship. And that may be coming for publishers at large when everything went online and now we're all talking to each other through Zooms. But generally speaking, it's not the real push to make these changes is not coming from a consumer. And I even read this morning in Axios an article about the impetus for some companies to do this coming from regulators and from investors, because if climate change disrupts, if there's fires or whatever is totally upending the supply chain, or a pandemic, that we need to be prepared as companies. What is our plan B? So let's ask our everybody else in the room, in your organization or in your world, where do you think the impetus is coming from to make these changes? Because they're difficult, and as Matt said, printing is as old as time. And people have done things the way they've done them for reasons that were good when they started doing them. So what's making us do this? Because it's kind of painful. All right, Hannah, how are we looking? And thank you to everybody who's willing to share. Look at that. Authors of Big Fat Zero. Okay, that's really interesting. Employees 50%. That's fantastic. You know, that let's collective voices moving things forward. So readers, that's great. Obviously, a lot of the folks we have here do have those relationships. Executive leaderships, yep, they read a book and they have that aha moment. So no government regulation and nothing else outside that. That's really helpful. So then that leads us to our question, Ariel, that I'd love for you to start with. You actually gave us some insight into that it was executive leadership that got this jump started. But what do you think beyond that? What has kept it going? Why does it put down roots and now you actually, this is your job there?
Yeah, I'm so glad to see that 50% of those who took the poll claim that employees are the biggest stakeholders, because I wholeheartedly agree. And in this industry at this current time, I think that employees have really driven the some of which are, you know, really proud to work for Macmillan because we have strong sustainability programs and we've had it since 2009, 2010. But some have, you know, really stepped up and wanted to engage further and ask us, you know, how we can change what we do every day, how we can change our team and division, et cetera. And I think that that's the most exciting piece, because if you don't have employee buy-in and executive leadership, then in theory, it's going to be a lot harder to get things to pass and to muster. So having executive sponsorship is incredibly important and always a must in all initiatives, you know, in corporations or businesses at large, but employees really driving it is what matters most.
Courtney, what about at PRH?
Yeah, just to echo what Ariel said, because I think the exact same. For me, it's all about, part of it is accountability where it's needed, but then there's that collective collaboration piece, which it's so strong when you've got employees telling you exactly, you know, what they think could be improved or how can I help. And actually, it's really interesting because in the publishing industry, I get approached at least once a month by an employee or another colleague to ask, how can I help? What can I do to make your life easier? Which is amazing to hear. And previously in the fashion industry, they would run away from me if I talked about sustainability or ethical trade. They'd be like, oh no, not you again. And I think that's really part of the publishing industry and how great it is, and the content that we have and the things that we produce is people absolutely love it and they want it to be special, right down to where it's sourced from and who's making it and how it is. So I think it's great that we have that, like, it's, you know, intertwined within our business needs. So yeah, just echo what Ariel said.
So Matt, your answer is automatically going to be different because you could have just said yes. You know, is it this, or this? Yes.
Yeah, all of the above. Well,
all
yeah.
of the above,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
what do you think, since you are in that embarrassment of riches situation, what do you think that your experience and Chelsea Green's experience, how can you take a piece of it out that people who don't have your embarrassment of riches, and how can they use what you know?
I mean, when I talk about an embarrassment of riches, it's a different size pot of riches, and I think that's a really important thing to note. Is that, you know, it is very, very no, it is not easy. That's not true. But if you have a very, very strong editorial mission, whatever it is, whether it's crime, whether it's regenerative and sustainable living like we have, whatever it might be, if you do it well and you do it without really thinking about the other elements, then people will find your books over time and then you will begin to grow. And, you know, we backlist very strongly, interestingly, for the type of books we do. The reason I mention that is because my challenge was telling that story to an entirely cold public that's used to a trade-facing conversation. So how do I make the UK business, how do I make UK readers, UK partner businesses, UK trade, how do I make them care, as in High Street, about our books, our topics, and have us next to other things? Part of that is slightly massaging the list for the UK, with me thinking and refocusing the list and buying in a slightly different way. You know, we go into kind of slow craft and nature and a few things that perhaps we didn't necessarily do so much in the US, but that's part of the joy of publishing, different regions and different books, you know. And that's a big question. So, you know, as an ex-marketer, always a marketer, once a marketer, always a marketer, you know, that is an eternal question. So what's interesting about the stories that the guys have got at Macmillan and PRH UK at the moment is, how do we build this narrative where for us it's so part of our narrative that if we don't connect with a buyer, they're like, well, okay, it's a green book, we don't sell green books. There is that malaise, and let's be clear, that is something that's very real. And we don't want to be seen as other. We want to be seen as viable on a table in front or back of stores as any other publisher. The question is, for the bigger houses, is how do you tell that story at an imprint level, at a corporate level? How do you tell it on press releases? How are you telling it on the back of the book? How are you telling it in the book? And it's not about the editorial mission. That's not what I'm saying. That happens to be our ethos. But it's how do you make that a conversation that when a reader is reading and reads about the author, below about our green mission, and this is what that's the question. And I think that's a really interesting question for big publishing to kind of take on. So my challenge is the inverse of theirs, which is how do I make people in sort of high street bricks and mortar engage with us even more so than we are now.
Great. All right, let's move on slightly. So Courtney, you said something that of course made most of us laugh. When you were in fashion and you came, we could like, perfect image, they start running in the other direction, and how happy you are that that's not what's happening now, and a reflection of that 50% of us here, it's the employees really driving this. So to get back to one of the things where we started, which each of you came from outside the publishing industry to publishing, what have you been able to do in your organization where you look at something and say, well, why do we do it that way? And your colleagues say, well, we've always done it that way. Can you think of an example or a way to get that conversation started where you look at something and able to see it through different eyes?
Want me to go first? Or?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Thank you.
So one thing that I'm developing at the moment is to have a CO2 emissions beside a printer or a paper mill. And that's actually going to be embedded in the kind of procurement production process. So when you do click onto a paper mill, you'll see everything about it, but you'll also see the CO2 emissions. And I think that is something that no one had really thought about it before. And it happened a discussion between me and my manager saying, how do we put sustainability and commerciality at the same kind of point? Which I think is really important. So that's something that's in developing, which is really exciting. And one thing that people had never done before, which was really interesting to me, is that no one had ever come to any production meetings to talk about just sustainability in general and what it means and how you can help and how you can support. And then that led on to green team meetings. And now we have, similar to Macmillan, so we have kind of like a green team, which like I lead and work with, but they kind of run like their own divisions, or like they're just kind of part, like making sure FSC is 100%, making sure we are looking at the materials that we're using and really putting onus onto it. So that's a couple of things that I've developed there.
All right, we seem to have a good flow going. We got our two biggies and our one guy out here in the field, quite literally in the boots sometimes. So Ariel, how about you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I want to talk more figuratively. So I think that relationship building is instrumental in sustainability everywhere. And I think that if you don't have those really strong relationships in terms of trust and understanding with the most instrumental people in the company, then you're also more likely to not get things to pass and to move forward. And I think that lessons I've learned along the way is half of sustainability is the science and the other half is about the people and the relationships.
And Matt, I know you had just briefly, can we hear your eureka moment that you had like in the last week or two? Like, oh,
the white space paradigm.
White space, yeah.
Yeah, and this is something, and bear in mind, this is, I've been doing this with Chelsea Green over 3 years now, and for me, it's been about learning. So from the start, it was taking this sort of, I'm a very broadly commercial publishing mind and kind of marketing mind. So I was having to run everything I was learning at this huge pace through that filter and going, is this viable? How do I make this work? How do I make this work for the UK market? How do I think about these US books coming through our list? And how do I tell that story? How do I tell the Chelsea Green story? So there was all that going on. And what's so interesting about what we do is because we've done it for so long that it's become second nature. I'm always finding new and interesting things out about sustainability that we happen to do that I'm like, why didn't you tell me that? You know, so for example, interesting, we do a lot of what we call practitioner titles. So big, you know, full color, sometimes sort of illustrative non-fiction books by, you know, whatever the subject be, whether it's food or farming or something similar. And we were having a conversation about a UK book that we had. And we were talking about page count and we were talking about white space. And white space in the UK, if you know about UK publishing, it's a big deal. We like white space. We like doing, you know, breathing. And we really sat there and had a conversation with my production director and my publisher, and we were chatting. And they said to me, well, one of the things that we do is we don't like white space. And we thought this was a kind of US UK aesthetic thing, which again is a really interesting part of being a truly kind of plugged in transatlantic kind of publisher. And I thought, okay, that's interesting, but it's maybe just a design thing. It said, no. It said the less white space we use, the more elegantly we design in a smaller space, then the less paper we use. And that's better for the environment. And and this was about a week ago. And I said, why haven't I known this before? I could have actually made this part of the narrative. I could have made this part of the story. I can explain this to authors. I can make this part of the conversation, because actually engaging, and we did notice that poll of, you know, 0 authors, is because, and in our case, that's not the case, but, you know, for most other publishers, it kind of is. And that's a really important consideration, because, you know, when you take it outside of the design aesthetic, and we were talking about this, Ashley and I, a couple of days ago, you know, you start multiplying, saving those 10, 15, 20, 30 pieces of paper on a book that could easily bulk out for whatever reason to that level. Suddenly you're saving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of leaves of paper through a year. And that's a really interesting model to just think about, you know. And to me, it was so simple that I just never considered it. And it really made me think differently about how we lay our books out and what we do. And it kind of made me reframe it, which was a really refreshing moment.
I've got a very quick question for Matt, which may just follow on from that, actually, because he clearly has a good relationship with his authors. But just given your sustainability ethos, do you ever come across the accusation that you're underprinting and under-distributing in order to be sustainable? And how do you negotiate that tension with your authors?
It's a good question, Joe. I haven't actually, I would tell you if we did, I haven't actually had that conversation, because we've been relatively well set up. We manage our own sales and our own warehousing in the US. So we're pretty self-contained. We're employee owned in the US. In the UK, we've had sales and distribution relationships with, you know, GBS and Watkins, and we're moving that conversation on. We've got a global head of sales based in London, a UK head of sales joining us next week. We're very focused on the commercials. There is no breakdown between the green mission and getting those books into market and making good money on them and growing that author. And I think, to your point, one of the things that we do, which is a really fascinating thing, and again, was genuinely new to me, was we just don't stop doing publicity and event work with authors, which I'd never heard of. I said, well, what do you mean? Like, you have to finish a campaign because that's how publishing works. And they said, no, we do a campaign and then we just keep working with authors. And I said, well, and it's like, yeah, 5, 6, 7 years down the line, we'll still push this authors for events that haven't had a new book out, because they're still relevant, they're still useful, they're still engaging to different communities. And that again, to your point, Ashley, is a totally different way of thinking about your resources, thinking about who's available to you, and sort of, you know, intelligent use of that. So to your point, Joe, you know, that I would say is a response to the kind of, it is an ongoing process, which can be tiring, but is, you know, ultimately pretty fulfilling, I think, for the authors and for the list, especially the backlist.
Perfect segue into our next scripted question. I am here at the under the blessing of HP. And part of how I spend my day is helping publishers to take advantage of globally distributed digital production. And this connects to several things y'all have mentioned. You know, printing locally. We're trying to not ship the same book all over the world back and forth. Trying to manage returns, maybe with a more just-in-time inventory. So so I'm going to throw it back to this. We'll do Ariel, Courtney, Matt, because Matt, I know you've talked about this quite a bit. The printing locally. COVID upended everything. Container ship stuck in the Suez Canal upended everything. So we've had lots of reasons to do what we do differently and to print differently and in different places. So how has the ability to print locally, to print digitally, how has that been used at Macmillan, or has it been used at Macmillan? Is that something y'all are taking advantage of now, or you're working toward? How does that figure into your sustainability strategy?
Yeah, so for right now, it's not really part of the sustainability strategy, it's more part of business strategy. So we're using this sort of printing with arcs and galleys, of course, to move things quickly, in short run books as well, if we need to print urgently and get those out. But we're not doing it at a very large scale at this time.
But we're going to talk more, right?
Sure.
All right, Courtney, how about BRH?
Similar in that sense. I mean, one of our largest printers is UK based for us, so that makes sense, and that's always been the way that it's set up. So when the pandemic hit first and kind of hit China and then it hit Italy, it just felt like things for us just shifted around. And then we've, and I think because of our UK printer, they then went over capacity because they also then worked with other printers, publishers. So then we had to go back to Italy, and it's all about kind of finding the best narrative. But we have actually just launched our sustainability policy, which I'll discuss later on. But within that, we have a special call out for local printing, because that, I think, is one of the key, especially moving forward in the space.
Right. We didn't even mention consolidation, especially in the US, lack of capacity and no paper. So Matt, you guys do use distributed digital printing. How come? Why do you do that? How does that figure in? What prompted that choice?
It tends to be for titles kind of on our back. It's more backlist title based at the moment, the way we tend to work. It's interesting. I think I was just musing on the kind of inverse model, which sometimes you don't think about until you're doing something like this. That, I think when a publisher looks, traditionally, if a publisher thinks there's going to be significant scale that they need to print to, they will offset that by it being an Asian print, big job, and then they'll ship it over time. It takes a while, loads of pressure on the covers, and we haven't talked about cover finish as a kind of relatively toxic thing, and how do you tell the market that you shouldn't actually be expecting this stuff. But I feel like that's for a different day. I'm not sure there's enough time today, but what's interesting is we do it the other way, which I've only just realized. So we only print in the UK and US respectively, and that has its own implications in terms of our own internal cost models, etc. But one of the interesting parts of that is if a book, so let's say a US book is doing really well in the UK market, if it hits a certain number of titles sold through a certain period, that's when we start printing it locally. So it's the opposite model. We tend to do it the other way around. And what we do tend to do is use that kind of deep backlist. When we get to a certain moment, the digital printing tends to kick in. We work with our warehouse in the US who have a function, and I'll talk to you after, Ashley, about that. But that's work that those guys do for us. But it's like an auto cap thing. When we drop below a certain amount, it bulks it before we make a decision on an offset run. So it isn't necessarily a primary solution, but it is a very, very relevant part of our production model.
Okay, thank you. Stage manager Hannah, we're going to skip the poll question 3 because we've kind of already covered that in other bits and pieces. And in interest of time, as we said at the beginning of this discussion, we really want this to be an hour that was well spent for all of you, and that you end this hour thinking differently about something, or you have an idea of, well, maybe I can take that back home. So let's shift to our two final questions for you guys to think about. What would you offer as guidance? Because we saw at the beginning, actually, there's quite a lot of resources that our audience has available to them. A few are just getting started. So think about who we're talking to. what would you offer them as how to move forward? You know, they've gotten started with the sustainability initiative. What's step 2? What's step 1 and what's step 2, or thing 1 and thing 2 for our Dr. Seuss fans? So let's give some people some practical advice of how to go do things differently after this call. Ariel, you go first.
I think what's interesting is looking at what other publishers have done is a real is a really great place to start. You know, sustainability is all about looking at what your peers are doing because you're not alone. So looking at what the other smaller publishers, if you're a smaller publisher, big publisher, if you're a big publisher, et cetera, are doing, and then defining how sustainability means to you and your organization. So we are very much on the carbon emissions as our guiding force in terms of how we make decisions environmentally. And sourcing renewable energy is not that difficult. It just requires some investment, but also is a really interesting opportunity because everyone understands what renewable energy is and thinks it's important.
Courtney?
So mine would be kind of, for us, if I talk about our sustainability policy, for instance, we developed that took a year to make because we got everybody else involved. So we actually went to the different departments and asked them, you know, what is it that you do? What do you think your principles and targets could be? And, you know, went around, and it took more time, but we engaged everyone quite slowly on the process of, this is, you know, the sustainability impacts that yours has. This is what we could offer as principal, and we'll support you in that. And then we launched the policy. But what else we did, we're developing a toolkit as well as part of that policy. We had our CEO announce it, and we had him talk through it. And then we did a webinar for people to join up to. So we really tried to engage everyone because, as you said, you know, 50% of this comes from your colleagues. So really, it's all about focusing the efforts on them and really engaging them. And if you're just starting out in this space and you don't even know what your priorities are, ask your colleagues because they're going to have an own input. And yeah, I think it's quite interesting to do that.
Yeah, and it's funny, you said that yesterday before we knew that the real impetus was coming from employees. So that's a proven first step. Ask what your people care about. And if they care about it already, they're far more likely to get on board. Okay, Matt, I want you to think about it slightly differently. So you went from a literary press that was not focused on sustainability to a company that was entirely focused on sustainability from its origins. If you were to go back to that other press that you came from, what's the first thing you would do when you got there?
Try and get hold of one of the proofs for the new Sally Rooney book, which I haven't got yet, but that would be my first movement.
Okay, your second.
My second would be, I think coming to a business that had a manifesto, a genuine manifesto, is a really interesting and powerful thing. And I think that one of the things that people can come together around, and it can be created by the people for the people, is the idea of a sustainable or green manifesto, whatever that stands for, and try and make it part of the relationship with everything you do. That's the first part. So that's something I think, and that's not a haughty big brand presentation piece in a boardroom. That is kind of getting people to understand what that really means. It means that it's a conversation around marketing materials, you know, using third-party people to create proofs or blads or samplers or whatever the thing is, or posters, you know, working with people on that level right the way through, obviously, to the production team, to the design team, thinking like we briefly touched on finishes. How do we tell a more sophisticated story about a more sophisticated look, maybe, that isn't based on finishes? That's a really interesting place for publishing to think about in the next 10 years or whatever. So that's part one. I think the other part is to shorten the disconnect in people's minds between when they do their recycling sorting on a Sunday night for bin pickup on Monday and what we do in the office. And what I mean by that is we produce products that sit in people's homes that then need to have some kind of outcome or life. And that's something that I think perhaps we love the idea of books being incredibly important and valuable, but at some point they're not. And then what happens to those books? And at some point they get moved on, or they get thrown away, or they get recycled or whatever. That conversation, I think shortening that in people's minds so that they understand that what they do in the office has that effect, you know, if we're not considering what we're doing 5 days a week, producing millions of copies of books a year, then what we're doing on a Sunday night, you know, separating our plastics and our papers it's kind of neither here nor there, you know. And I think that's a really interesting place for people to really take a step back and consider, if we do love what we do as an industry and we are passionate about home recycling, how do you bring that conversation together around people and make them feel that they're not having to leave one at home and have another one in the office?
Good stuff, all of you. Joe, are our attendees, are they just chomping at the bit to ask a question? We have
I had a question which I'm going to pass on to speakers afterwards, because it was particularly about protecting journals and things through some sort of recyclable wrap, and whether you've got any experience of that. But I know that we've got 4 minutes to go, and I know you probably have one more question to ask, Ashley.
Yeah, and certainly if anybody, any of the attendees have questions, please feel free to, you know, send them in and we can distribute offline and continue the conversation, because I think we're incredibly lucky to have 3 such capable and passionate people to talk to us. And this is not nearly enough time to really get down. And my vision, I can see this like in-person all-day workshop where we all do this together one day again. That would be my dream. Hi, Paul. So last thing, what have we not said today that we absolutely should have? What is the thing that's just burning in you to get out and make sure everybody here knows? But we have 3 minutes, so each of you have 1 minute. Matt, contain yourself, go first, and then we'll let Courtney and Ariel take us off.
Me?
Yeah, you.
I was hoping you were going to go the other way around. I feel for me, I feel this, and I hope it's been, you know, I know it's a different scale for a lot of people, this conversation. I'm fully appreciative that there is a big different conversation to have at businesses with thousands of people in different continents. But I think that, you know, if you start thinking about the fact that we're created on an imprint level as a business, fundamentally, or, you know, big publishing houses are born of small imprints which kind of club together. Each of those has an identity. You can create that identity and that feeling at a grassroots level in publishing houses of scale. And, you know, that is a really interesting thought for people in terms of, if you are a big house, break it down into the small parts, break it down into, you know, what might this imprint be our vanguard for when it comes to sustainable or regenerative thinking, and what might this imprint be? And then that's a really interesting place, fits under your umbrella, but it changes that conversation, makes people feel like they're responsible in a different way. So that's, I think, as much as I've got for today.
That's perfect. Yeah, break it down into manageable chunks. We can't solve this problem in a day. Ariel, what you got? And everybody hang around an extra 2 minutes so we can finish.
That is also what I was going to say. Sustainability is incredibly complex and integrated into everything and anything, but you should start somewhere. And so leveraging what your employees find most passionate or like the things where I would start. And I think that, you know, making impactful sustainability initiatives happen is a journey. And there isn't really a destination. It's kind of always an evolving process. So just, you know, let that unsettling thought, you know, sit with you.
Perfect. We're all learning. Forgive yourself. It's okay to start small. Courtney, finish this off.
I guess, yeah, echoing the other points, but mine would also be collaboration is key. We're not doing this alone. The fact that we're all here together at the moment is fantastic. And I think we all can't do this individually. You know, one company does it, no one's leading it. I think we've all got to be doing this journey together. So I would say, if you feel lost, if you're unsure, we're a network of people that will be able to help and support you. So please do come to us, because we're all trying to do the same thing and do what's right by our planet.
Lovely end. Perfect. Thanks to the 3 of you so much. Thank you, Joe, for facilitating all of this. Thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks for HB letting me do this, because this was great fun and I really hope we get to do it again.
Thank you. A big thank you from me too to all our speakers, and Ashley for chairing it so brilliantly. Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope we'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.